Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our show Perspective, where we bring you detailed analysis of all key national and international issues as well. Today we're going to talk about the wildlife, the conservation of wildlife and restoration of ecosystem as well. In fact, humans rely on wildlife and biodiversity-based resources to meet all our needs, from food to fuel, medicines, housing and clothing. Millions of people are also dependent on the nature as their source of livelihood and economic opportunities. According to data from the International Union for Conservation of Nature, that is IUCN's Red List of Threatened Species, over 8,400 species of wild fauna and flora are critically endangered, while close to 30,000 more are understood to be endangered or vulnerable. As per this data, 239 faunal species which are known to occur in India are classified as endangered species, which includes 45 species of mammals, 23 species of birds, 18 of reptiles, 30 of amphibians and 114 species of fishes. India has a network of 733 protected areas, including 103 national parks, 537 wildlife sanctuaries, 67 conservation reserves and 26 community reserves. This approximately covers 4.89% of the country's total geographical area. Today, we will discuss what really needs to be done for conservation of wildlife and restoration of ecosystem as well. And for more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of guests. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with, we have with us in the studio here today, Ms. Neha Sinha. She is a conservation biologist and an author. Recently has written a book as well on 15 odd species in India, some of which are threatened. We are also joined by Dr. M.K. Ranjit Singh. He's the former director of wildlife preservation with the Government of India, and Dr. Sejal Vora is joining us, program director, WWF India. Welcome all of you to Sansad Television. I'll begin with you, Neha, and let's start by putting things in perspective here. The name of the show as well, coincidentally, but for our viewers to understand, one, why are we talking about wildlife, and two, how much of this is a serious issue when we are looking at the overall problems which are facing us as a race, human beings as a race?
Thank you for having me. So India has a lot of wildlife, and we still have a lot of wildlife. So we have big cats like tigers and leopards and lions. We have elephants, these giant animals. We have rhinos. But at the same time, it's becoming less and less abundant. So broadly speaking, we still have important populations which are really important on the global scale. So we have more than 70% of the world's tigers, about 3,000 tigers. We have about 30,000 elephants, which is a significant number in the Asian elephant population. We have the last population of the Asiatic lion. And we have the last breeding population of the great Indian bustard, which is the state bird of Rajasthan. Having said that, they're all going through different kinds of stresses. Habitat loss is a really big one. And broadly speaking, wild animals have some kind of protection inside national parks and tiger reserves and sanctuaries. They're not so protected the moment you step out. So the moment you step out, there are tigers outside Bhopal right now, for example. Before this, there have been tigers outside Lucknow, and in Pilibhit, in other fields, they've been killed. So the destiny of an animal outside, a protected area is really uncertain.
Okay.
And even protected areas today are getting threatened by a huge number of projects. So ports and mines and irrigation projects, linking of rivers, Ken-Betwa, for example, proposed in Madhya Pradesh. So while we still have very important global populations, there is a plethora of threats that needs to be tackled.
Yeah. That's the Indian context perfectly, put in place in the context by you, Neha. But I'd like to bring in Dr. Vora here as well. Now, if we look at the IUCN data, that is a staggering figure which we're looking at globally. 8,400 species are critically endangered, around 30,000 vulnerable. So it looks like the problem is manifold.
You mentioned those figures, but what you didn't mention is an even more staggering figure, which is from the same report, that there are today over 1 million species at risk of extinction. And that is really staggering. So the issue right now for us is, how do we reverse this? How do we halt and reverse this incredible loss of nature? As you mentioned in your opening remarks, there is greater recognition today that nature is at the heart of everything. There are global rallying cries for conservation of biodiversity. We've had heads of state and leaders at various UN meetings talking about the fact that nature is now at the core of everything. Now, this is heartening for many of us, including, Dr. Ranjit Singh has been around for a very, very long time with this battle cry. Neha and I, also have been doing this, but for a much shorter period of time. But for us, it's heartening in a way to see that this recognition about, wildlife, biodiversity, and nature, and the importance of conserving it is no longer seen as, the repository of a few people. It's been being seen as something that is essential for the future survival of humanity itself.
Okay.
So while that is important, we still have these staggering figures of extinction continuing unabated. At the same time, we've also seen that it is possible to reverse the loss of nature. So it's still not too late, I would say. I mean, we are seeing, for example, in India itself, we've seen recovery of populations of tigers, etc. We've also seen the return of wolves, for example, in the Northern Hemisphere and many parts of Europe. So it is possible to reverse it. It is possible to actually bring nature back if we have the willingness and the resources to do it.
Okay.
The technology is there, the knowledge is there. It's just that we need to really be willing to do this, and we will be able to bring nature back. And rewilding and restoration is something that is clearly possible. So the time is now. If we don't act now, it's probably going to be too late.
Okay, indeed, the time is now, and that's a very positive, thought that you're putting in. Place here that yes, it can be done. We'll come to the specifics as well as to how it can be done. But I'd like to bring in Dr. Ranjit Singh here. Dr. Ranjit Singh, you've been there, you've seen it all through in terms of what all we have done, both for protecting or conservation of wildlife, and also what has not been done. The question is, despite all the steps taken, why are we looking at these staggering figures?
Firstly, I would like to make it clear that wildlife doesn't mean animals only or birds only. It means a composite whole of the habitat. You can have the habitat without a wild animal, but you cannot have a wild animal without the habitat. And therefore, the Wildlife Act defines what wildlife is, found in nature, and the animal being an integral part of the habitat.
Indeed.
You cannot save a wild animal till you save the habitat. And the most important thing is to save habitat. In the process, you're saving not just the species, you're saving the national natural heritage. One. The second thing is that in saving that, you are saving the sources of potable water, which next to oxygen is the most important natural commodity in the whole world. Potable water. 396 perennial streams flow from the catchment areas that are now under the protected area system. But we have to take a decision here that are we going to save, to use the cliche or adage of Mahatma Gandhi, after satisfying not just the need, but the greed of everybody. Are we going to save the residue, or at least going to save the 4.98% of the area, land area of
the geographical area, yeah.
Is there nothing safe in this country? Is there nothing sacrosanct? Everything is so safe in the name of so-called development. We have just been commissioned a report by the Supreme Court. We've submitted it. And we've said what that means. The value of the tree in carbon dioxide sequestration alone is worse than the timber value. Oxygen production is another factor. These are all composite factors. We are taken in by large species, and God bless them. And they are flagship species, but they are not the be-all and end-all. They are, as I said, icons. And I was the first member secretary, we started Project Tiger. We used the tiger to save something much more valuable than the tiger itself.
Indeed.
The wild habitats of the tiger. So you use that. And to wind up, we have had a wonderful track record.
Okay.
We have had, despite the humongous pressure on land, or poverty, ignorance, whatever, foreign yoke, subsistence level existence. We have not lost a single large mammalian species except for the cheetah and the two rhinoceros species which were on the peripheral area.
Okay.
But now, as Sejal and Neha have said, there are a number of species on the anvil of extinction. And while the cheetah went extinct because we didn't know how to stop it, now
we know how to do it.
Any species goes extinct, it will be deemed to have been allowed to go extinct. And that's the difference.
Okay. Okay. Now
allowed to go extinct because we didn't have the gumption, the political will to stop it. We know this.
Okay.
We know how to stop it. We just didn't take that extra step.
That's...
And in the case of the bustard, Neha has referred to, which is on the threshold, there are less than 100 birds left in the whole world. And the one breeding population outside Jaisalmer district, the third breeding population in Bellary district of Karnataka, was driven into extinction by the very department which been commissioned by the Constitution to save it. Okay. The Forest Department built watchtowers there, and the bustards just disintegrated and went.
Okay, but that's a very important point. I'd like to come in here, Dr. Ranjit Singh. That's a very important and significant point which you're making, and a very, very interesting way of looking at things as well. That we have done a lot, and we've now learned how to tackle this particular issue as well, Neha. But as Dr. Ranjit Singh is pointing out, and you're also referring to save wildlife or to conserve wildlife, we'll have to conserve the habitats. Now, the question is, how should we move about it? We know what should be done, but how should we move further about it?
The best way is to identify ecosystems and protect them. And animals are able to recolonize places. And, for certain animals that are critically endangered, we need some more urgent steps. So like Great Indian Bustard, Dr. Ranjit Singh referred to, is the state bird of Rajasthan. And it can't see very well, so it keeps colliding into these lines, power lines, and it keeps dying. So the #1 cause of mortality is power lines today, and there are only 100 birds left in the world. And they're all in Rajasthan and Gujarat. So all the new power lines that are coming up, Dr. Ranjit Singh is a petitioner for that case. We are saying take them underground. It's going to be much more expensive, but it's worth doing because, losing a species forever in the wild is just it's a cost that we can't pay. And we can have Great Indian Bustards in captivity, and we do actually have a captive breeding program. But that's not the idea. We don't want to keep them in cages.
Indeed.
They should be in the wild, and if the habitat gets destroyed beyond repair, like if we have so many wires, they're never going to be taken down. So we are saying now, for a bird like that, critically endangered species need critical and urgent interventions.
Okay.
So let's not destroy the last remaining Thar Desert with, electric wires, and not destroy the last remaining Kutch sands with wires. And similarly for other areas, we have critically endangered species, and we've already told the government, what needs to be done.
Okay.
But they have to be done super fast, as Dr. Vora said. We don't have time. Time is something we don't have.
Okay, time is of essence here, and time is something which we're running out. And of course, we know what needs to be done. Now that clearly puts a picture to us as to where do we stand and what needs to be done. Dr. Vora, again, this might sound a sort of a repeated question, but I need to understand, the viewers also need to understand as to what we are doing seemingly is what all of you are pointing out as domain experts seemingly is not enough. Then what will be enough?
So basically, what will be enough is that we should have zero tolerance, absolutely zero tolerance in this country for conversion of any further important ecosystems or habitats to other forms of land use.
Okay.
And this is the only thing that is going to, as Dr. Ranjit Singh said, less than 5%. Today, less than 5% of our area is actually strictly protected. We cannot afford to lose that. I mean, if we cannot protect 5% of our country's forests, lands, waters, then I think we are doomed for a downhill scenario or a downhill spiral. So I think first of all we should all agree that this 5% is sacrosanct. We then need to think about as Neha also mentioned, is what happens to the wildlife that is outside of this 5%, and what kinds of innovative means do we need to create for coexistence of people and wildlife. It is possible. There are many methods that we can, and I can't get into the details of it here, but there are ways in which people and wildlife can coexist, and they have coexisted in India for many millennia. So it's not something that is not doable. So first of all, we need to make sure that we don't convert any further habitat. We have ways and means of doing that. There is technology today about how to build roads better through wildlife habitats. There is technology about rivers and cleaning up rivers again. So all that is there. But the bottom line is that it costs money. And are we willing to pay the cost of saving our wildlife and biodiversity, or are we not willing to pay it? So bottom line, it boils down to political will. And if we are willing to pay for it and pay the cost, which future generations will thank us for, then there are solutions. But if we are not willing, and every time we say that, oh, that's going to cost more, or we need X more than Y, or we don't have, the budgets have not been built in to build an overpass, then we are always cutting corners.
Okay.
And every time you cut a corner, you're losing ecosystems, you're losing habitats, and you're losing species and wildlife. So to me, it's about better planning, better design, and allocating resources for ensuring. This is a country that is going to develop. We can't get away from the fact that we are going to have development, that we are going to have solar power, that we are going to have a lot of areas that are going to sort of be needed for this development. The question is, how do we balance that? And again, there are ways of balancing how you generate electricity, how you generate power, and whether you do it at the cost of your last remaining wilderness, or whether you do it in a smarter, more innovative way by using degraded land, by using rooftop, by using areas which are already which have been already converted, and sort of building on top of that, rather than going into pristine areas for generating power, for example.
Okay.
So so I think the recognition and the willingness needs to be there, and we need to then ensure that the cost of conservation is built into our development models.
Okay, recognition, conservation, and the cost of conservation rather to be built into the development model. Now that brings me to Dr. Ranjit Singh. Dr. Singh, if we have to understand, how do we strike this balance between the need for development and the more urgent need to protect the wildlife as well, not only the animals or the flora and fauna, but the habitat itself, as you were pointing out earlier? How should it be done? What are the key focus areas which we should look at, or the policymakers should look at?
If somebody asks me today, what is the one single factor that needs to play a role, which would be the deciding factor whether India saves its national natural heritage, and that is political will. Conservation in India, unfortunately, has always come from the top. There's no Green Party movement. So it's a paradox, because we are in many respects one of the few countries in the world where it was the easiest to protect nature, because there is an empathy for nature. We are vegetarians. But the conservation impetus has always come from the top. And I won't go into detail. That's the first criteria.
Okay.
And as was pointed out by my colleagues, the remaining area, which is less than 5%, they are what I would call the last havens of hope. And there, at least, the conservation interest should be paramount. There, at least. Elsewhere, I have very little hope. I was very right. What happens to these huge areas? You look what happened in Project Tiger. When we started off, there were less than 20% in the project. I understand. When we began, there were 12 areas, 9 and 12, and now over 50. But now, 90+% are in the tiger reserve. Why? Because elsewhere there is nowhere. You see, our parks are too small. They are islands surrounded by seas of humanity.
Okay.
And the connectivity is gone. And when they come out, there is human conflict because there's no interflow between protected areas. So those areas, and you build roads through them. And you would say, and now I believe in reserve forests also government has given permission to build residential quarters. These are 1 hectare will be cancerous growth within this. It's not the area which matters.
Okay.
It's the cascading effect, the ramifications of human ingress in these areas. And I won't go into detail, but certain areas, at least there, the conservation interest should be paramount, permanent.
Okay.
And that will look after that. But there is one little thing which has been forgotten and overlooked by all.
Okay.
And that is genetic swamping. Genetic swamping of our wild animal species. The most important to human welfare, because the wild counterparts, whether it's the cultivars or of the wild animals and birds, the wild counterparts are the most important for human welfare.
Okay.
Today, the most important animal for human welfare today, if you take it from totally economic point, is the wild buffalo. There are more domestic buffaloes in the world today than any other domestic animal. And our wild buffaloes have gone. They've mixed with the domestic. They have been genetically rendered a mixture.
Okay.
Genetic swamping. The same thing is happening with wild boar, particularly in the Andamans elsewhere. It's happening with our jungle fowl and red and grey. And this is something we are not just simply looking at. Even the scientists are not. And that's very sad. Because you must have your genetic importance for human welfare. I'm talking about, because they are, today the most important parts are wild cotton, wild apples, all that. They're required for human welfare, because you have gone and utilized those species for your cultivation. And the same applies to, the same way applies to domestic asses and their wild counterparts, but they are all right. But the others are going. So this is another dimension which we don't think about, which is not to do with.
That's again a very interesting dimension you brought out, Dr. Ranjit Singh, and this theme seems to be that that harmony which we keeps on talking about, that has to be put in practice, Neha. And how do we do that in terms of course, as Dr. Sejal was also referring to, and Dr. Ranjit Singh was also saying, that we can't wish away the needs for development. The development will happen, but that needs to happen with keeping the needs of conservation of wildlife habitat in mind. Is that what the crux is?
Yes, I think when we are planning our projects, planning our land use, we need to consider that animals live there also. And we are talking about some very big animals over here. So we can't just wish them away. Usually what happens, we make a railway line through a forest, we widen a road through a forest, and we say the animal will adjust. But clearly they're not able to adjust. So 60 elephants dying every year, for example, getting hit by either trains or getting hit by cars on highways. Tigers, leopards, every animal dies on a highway or a railway line. So, while we make our projects, we need to think of animal movement. A lot of animals migrate, and all the data is out there. It's not like we have to study it all over again. We have a very fine sort of last 50 years of studying of these animals. So that's the first thing, just kind of planning better and not expecting that the animal will just disappear or just, I don't know, like go underground. And the second is the people of India need to understand that wild animals need wild habitat. As Dr. Ranjit Singh said, there's no point keeping them in cages. It's not supposed to be in a cage. If you keep a wild tiger in a cage, you're actually killing the animal spirit. So we need habitat, and we also need wild habitat for our own self to be able to go into wild nature. And also it's a genetic treasure for future, diseases, future pandemics that happen. Where do we get our medicines from? It all comes from nature, right?
Indeed.
So people should understand. I think people do love animals in India, but let's all try to understand that we can't have animals, wildlife, without the wild habitat. So we need to have
it's not for only their benefit, but our own benefit, for the benefit of human species as well. Thank you so much, Neha, Dr. Sejal, as well as Dr. Ranjit Singh, for sharing your views and insights. Very interesting points which have been made by our experts here, and clearly this points out to one fact, that time is of the essence to go ahead and take the action in terms of conserving wildlife, in specific the wildlife habitats, and restoring the overall ecosystem as well. A lot of steps have been taken in the past, but a lot more needs to be done, as we're losing the species one by one, and we're losing time as well. We'll come back again with a different topic. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.